Econ 145 students. Today I would like to go through and kind of try to do an example of how a economic theory and model section should go. I don't have a ton prepared for this, but I want to just give you a sense of this. There's no one way to do it, and it's going to depend a lot on what models and what theories you're using to connect your explanatory variable of interest to your dependent variable. But I'm going to go through with this sort of loose example I've been using throughout the semester of a consumer confidence index based on sports teams' winning percentages, and just kind of talk about it and give you a sense of how the discussion should look. Everybody's models are going to be different. Everybody's theories are going to be different because you're all explaining different phenomena, different things. But this will hopefully give you a sense of just sort of how to put this together. So I've got the scariest thing in the world, a blank document, and I'm going to just start typing a little bit about what kinds of things I want to say. So I'm going to talk about how I want to connect these classic economics ideas to my modern hypothesis and talk about how I expect changes in my X to affect changes in my Y. And you want to make sure you have that dynamism built in, that dynamic, because if X changes and Y doesn't change, that's bad for your hypothesis, usually, right? So there's going to be some introduction where I might say something like, I'm going to reference Keynes, that's always a good idea. Keynes wrote that a market sometimes seemed to be motivated not by rationale, but by, quote, animal spirits. And I'm going to be lazy here, and I'm not going to be doing my citations because I don't want to waste a bunch of time inserting citations that I into this, when really what I want to do is just give you a sense of how this should look. But I am going to fix my font and my spacing. There we go. This idea that consumers are driven by their psychology has a long history in economics. But is difficult to predict. Let's say this, difficult to measure and even more difficult to predict. Consumer confidence, measures are designed to be leading indicators for the economy, predicting future growth through consumer behavior. And then I want to probably talk about how this is modeled into GDP, right? It's all part of my original GDP model, so maybe I'll want to insert an equation to explain that. So I'll use the equation editor here. So go up to insert, equation, and then I'm going to say y equals c plus I plus g plus nx, right? And so I'm going to talk about how GDP growth is driven in no small part by consumer spending, which is often subject to the animal spirits Keynes spoke of. And maybe I'll talk about some of the consumer confidence stuff that I've referenced in my literature, talk some more about those models, talk about how consumer confidence ties into GDP and into that consumption spending. I'm going to want to talk about positive attitudes about the economy tend to drive up the marginal propensity which everybody knows, but I'm just going to add it in anyway. The proportion of each dollar earned that a consumer spends on consumption rather than saving. Increasing, here we go. Predicting increases in the MPC can be key to and then maybe I'll talk about how maybe I found something in sports. Economists have some magical model that talks about consumer sentiments that I will use to tie my stuff together. So, obviously I don't have another theory in here. I'm not going to waste time looking up a theory or doing a lot of research, but this gives you a sense, right? I'm connecting these ideas together with equations, and if I'm going to use equations and I might need to reference it later, I can go in here and number them. So I will do that this way. We'll make this centered. One sec. Okay, so if you're going to reference these equations, then one thing you'll want to do is number them. And that can be a little bit tricky to format, but it's going to look something, oops, don't do that, like this. Right? And so then I can say something like increasing the percentage of each dollar spent drives up the consumption portion of GDP. See equation 1 or something like that. Right? So now it's easy for the reader and I to reference those equations. So that's one thing you want to do. You want to connect exactly what you're talking about to these larger theories. And then the other thing you might want to do is insert a graph to explain it. And so the easiest way to draw graphs in Word, in my experience, is to use the Shapes editor. I have a YouTube video on this. I'm going to go through it a little bit quickly. The YouTube video also goes through it a little bit quickly. But that's another thing you can do to help explain it. So if you've got a labor market graph or supply and demand graph or anything like that, there's a ton. There's not a graph I haven't already made in Word, I promise. So let me know what you're working on, and if it's a little more complicated than this, we can work on that. But I'm going to use the arrows to create my axes. And once you draw the figure, you can edit the shape and the size and the color. I have a very specific way I like to do them. I like pretty thick black axes, and I actually like to just copy and paste this one. So I'm going to copy and paste that little arrow so it's the exact same size and shape. And then I go over here to the shape format, and in arrange, I can just ask it to rotate it 90 degrees. And now I've got this lovely axis, my x-axis and my y-axis, and then I'm going to say I want to do some do some model of increased economic growth. I'm going to do like the laziest Econ 1A model of GDP. So I've got long run aggregate supply here. And I'm going to go ahead and let that stay blue, but I'm going to make it thicker. And then we're going to have an upward sloping, I guess that's not the way I want to do it. I want to do a more realistic aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So here's what I'll insert then. I'm going to need a curvilinear shape. And so I'm going to want to use this wobbly tool, and it's going to allow me to click one point and then pull my graph out, click another point, and then pull it out like this. And then I get that upward sloping, unique, long run aggregate supply graph that I'm looking for. So now I've got some long run aggregate supply curve that's got that kind of shape I wanted, where it's flat when we're not experiencing changes in the price level, but upward sloping when we are experiencing changes in the price level. And then I want to go in here and insert a straight line for my aggregate demand. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a different color for my own reasons, because I like colorful graphs. I'm going to get it into the position I want, and I'm going to copy it and paste it because I want to have a second aggregate demand curve out here that's going to show the growth in aggregate demand that results from positive consumer sentiment and from increased marginal propensity to consume. The other thing I want to do is I like to use these text boxes to label everything. So I'm going to put a text box here. And again, I put it in first and then I format it afterwards. I'm going to call it long run aggregate supply. And then I'm going to go ahead and say that, and these formatting shortcuts make it really easy. I want it to be black. Text with no outline and no background. And then I'm going to copy and paste that, put it down here, and I'm going to call it aggregate demand. And I'm even going to go ahead and label it over here with a subtext 2 or a subscript, and aggregate demand 1, which I'll label with a subscript 1. And then I can do the same thing over here with calling this GDP. And so it's not super hard, and there's a learning curve on this, and I'm happy to help with any weird things that you might encounter, but it's not super hard to make a really professional specific graph that can articulate and describe what you're trying to talk about. And then, let's see. Oops. Oh, that's the mistake I made. So one thing you might have is you can see some of this stuff will get anchored to the text, like this long run aggregate supply is anchored to the text. And so if I want to keep writing, it's going to make a mess. The other thing you can do is if you have your, you can always take a screenshot of your graph, or you can do this other handy trick, which is if you select multiple parts, you can group them together. So you select the parts that you want for your graph. And I'm using, on my Mac, I'm using Command Select. It's going to be a different function on PCs, and I'm sorry about that. But I can select all my elements of my graph, and if I group them together, then they'll move together like one element that I've created. So I'll go through here, and then I'll wrap up my my theory section by saying something like, maybe I'll talk about the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, uses surveys of households which are historically unreliable. Positive or negative sports outcomes is expected to predict consumer sentiment without the possibility of sampling error. So again, trying to anchor my research in existing economic theory, right? I'm talking about someone else who also looks at the marginal propensity to consume and consumer sentiment and consumer confidence as a driver of GDP. Let's talk about them and how it ties into my theory. So hopefully that makes sense. This should be 1 to 3 pages, depending. If you put graphs in, it's going to take up a lot of space. You're going to need more pages. So there's really not a hard and fast limit on this, but it has to be long enough that you can explain whatever model you're talking about. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this gives you a sense of what you're going to be talking about and how you could put this together. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.